This is Left Hand. Thank you for tuning back into Left Hand. This is Sarepti, aka Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast, and today's episode involves an interesting intersection of Lacanian Psychoanalysis and Chan or Zen Buddhism. This episode was suggested by a friend of ours on the Acid Horizon podcast, John, who's very active in our reading groups. And I will just say, as this particular podcast is developing, I would like to do little curios just like this from time to time. Odd intersections of theory, psychology, politics, alchemy, esotericism, weirdness, anything else. So if you know someone who's ripe for this podcast, please let me know. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has supported so far. I have many supporters at the $5 level. That's great. If you are interested in these more offbeat interventions in the world of philosophy, politics, psychology, and so forth, just support me on Patreon and this podcast will continue. Okay, let's get to today's interview with Raul Moncoya on Lacan and Chan Buddhism. This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig, of the Acid Horizon podcast. Today, we approach the question, how might have the ideas of Jacques Lacan and his method of psychoanalysis been shaped by an encounter with Chan Buddhism? Today, I'm joined by Raul Moncoya, an author and thinker, who, along with co-author Yang Yu, helps bridge together two seemingly disparate worlds, Lacanian psychoanalysis and Buddhist philosophy. So in this conversation, we'll explore how these two traditions, one rooted in the Western psychoanalytic tradition, the other in Eastern spiritual thought, converge to address the profound questions of human suffering, identity, and transformation. From the intricacies of Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and real, to the Buddhist concepts of no self, emptiness, and Nirvana, we'll unpack the connections that Raul brings to Lacan and Chan Buddhist thought, available on Routledge Press. And some questions that might come up in the discussion today include, how does Lacan's concept of the real reshape our understanding of Buddhist teachings? What might happen when we integrate psychoanalytic and meditative practices? And can these dialogues provide new pathways for understanding the nature of our lives and the obstacles we face in today's world? So let's start with you. It sounds like you have a very interesting background. Could you share a bit about what led you in your life to engage with both Buddhism and Lacanian psychoanalysis?
Well, I was living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I was about 17 years old. And I was studying psychology, and I had a mentor, Roberto Arari, who is deceased, who was a Lacanian analyst in Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires is like the Paris of South America. And so there's a lot of cultural influence. And so there were many schools of Lacanian psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires, just like in Paris. And then at the same time, I had a couple of friends who were interested in spirituality. And the brother of one of my friends had been to a monastery in Japan and practiced Zen. So I met him and he told me about it. And she looked at me straight in the eyes and told me, Raul, I think you should practice Zen. So then I finished studying psychology and went to live in Europe with my girlfriend at the time and traveled for about 6 months. And then went to Paris and there met a friend who was practicing at the Paris Zen Center of Taisen Deshimaru. Taisen Deshimaru is the other big Japanese teacher who brought the practice of Zen to Paris. I don't think Lacan ever mentioned meeting him. Then I came to San Francisco and got a PhD in social clinical psychology and was one of founding member of a Lacanian school in San Francisco, the first school in the US. At the same time, I came to live in Berkeley, and I found about the Berkeley Zen Center, and that was 40 years ago. He became my teacher was Sojourn Mel Weitzman, who was the disciple of Suki Roshi, who brought Zen from Japan to San Francisco and started big institutions of Zen in San Francisco. And then, I was ordained as a priest, and then I was given transmission. And then my teacher asked me to start another center in El Cerrito. And he set me up for it. And so that's what I'm doing now. And he died about 3 years ago. And then the psychoanalysis. So we created this school. And then, other people wanted to teach and wanted patience and so on. So I decided to leave that behind, and I started a Chinese American Center for Freudian Lacanian Studies. And I traveled to China, and I found out about Chan, or Chinese Buddhism in China now. I mean, Chan doesn't exist anymore. It survived only in Japan. And so the Buddhism they have in China is Mahayana Buddhism, like Zen too, but their practice is chanting. They wear robes, they don't get married, and they chant the sutras for their practice. And they have these huge statues of the Buddha. So the Buddha is a deity. And just to conclude, I mean, I wrote 2 books. First, more general on psychoanalysis and Zen Buddhism, where I address the literature on psychology and religion. And then this more specific one that I wrote on Lacan and Chan Buddhism.
I think one of the important questions for me, especially as somebody who actually had their intellectual start in Buddhist studies, and maybe a lot of people don't know this about me, but my first contact with anything of an intellectual bent was Taoism and Buddhism. And I grew up as a teenager in the 1990s, and it was only perhaps until later that I saw my experience as part of a larger arc, not only in the US, but maybe in Western culture itself, where the infusion of Eastern traditions came, of course, it was in the writers of the 19th century, like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, of course, had contact with the Upanishads and Buddhism and so forth. But particular to the United States, we have, of course, the Beat Generation and, Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, and everything that's happening in San Francisco where you are. And by the time that Buddhism had come to my generation, it had been very much marketized. But had it not, I probably wouldn't have had the significant contact that I did with it early on, and it was a kind of kindling for my intellectual life. These days, we don't hear as much, or at least I don't hear as much, about Buddhism in popular culture here in the United States. And I was wondering if you could just make any comments about the trends that are happening in Buddhism today, particularly with the social media age and so forth, and what are some like big changes that you have seen in your lifetime as a practicing Buddhist?
Well, I mean, the students and the teachers have become old. There isn't the kind of infusion of the 60s and 70s where there was a lot of people practicing. So there are some young people coming in, but they don't have the same energy or interest, like they don't want to dedicate their lives to the practice. Part of it is that, the Zen Center as an institutions, they offer subsidized housing. And since housing has become so expensive in California, and people who practice Zen usually don't have money, so that helps to bring students to be able to offer them residency. But unfortunately, I can't do that. I don't have the space for it. I mean, I have an in-law, but I have to rent it at market value.
Could you talk then about this book out on Routledge? It's Lacan and Chan Buddhist Thought. And unfortunately, we don't have a young you here today who is the co author on the book. Just talk to me a little bit about this project. How did this book come together? What was the intention behind it? In fact, I just want to give a credit or a shout out to one of my co-collaborators in reading groups that I do. His name is John. He pointed to this particular book and he said it would be perfect for this particular podcast that I do because it brings together what we might ordinarily think are two completely different traditions, but as I've read in the book, there has been significant contact. Well, Lacan had very significant contact with Buddhism at one time. And the claim is that many of his concepts and ideas are derived from some of the ideas and images of Buddhism. So perhaps you could say a few things about that.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it is as much as that Buddhism or Chan shaped Lacan's thought, because he had many influences, right? He was an interdisciplinary thinker. He was primarily a Christian. And his brother was a Jesuit priest who buried him. He wanted to have a Christian burial. But there were some translators of Mahayana texts, one by the name of Demiaville, who was a teacher of Lacan. Lacan went to his seminar on Vasubandhu. And there, I suppose that he must have heard of the threefold knot of the real, symbolic, and imagined. It has a little different. The symbolic in Buddhism means interdependence. Like language, words need other words to function and to produce meaning. So language is interdependent. So that's the symbolic in Vasubandhu. The imagined opens the question of, is there a difference between the imagined and the imaginary? Because the imaginary in Lacan is a necessary illusion, like the specular image. The image that one has in oneself is a necessary illusion. But the imagination also points to the real. Like an image, a finger, the image of a finger points to the real, or points to the moon as the real. And Jung, of course, talked about the archetypes at length. But Lacan, by the imaginary, he meant first, between 6 months and 18 months, we acquire an integrated body image in front of the mirror, or in front of the eyes of the mother, which is our mirror. And if the mother loves you and has desire for the child, then she looks as the child as a pretty thing. And the child recognizes that image in the mirror as that pretty thing that the child is. So the child is always one and another, right? Because we are one person, but then we're also our mother originally. Then the imaginary becomes related to the father and the question of the law and how people want to compete and succeed to love themselves and want others to love them for their success and want to love themselves for their success. So that's the other aspect of the imaginary. The symbolic is, like I said, the structure of language, but also is the structure of the law. America is a country of laws, not of men, right? So like the Constitution is the law. But the law also creates desire, because you have to accept what you can't have within society, to accept symbolic castration. and then look for substitutes to satisfy desire, which never completely satisfy desire. So the object of desire that most satisfies is what Lacan calls the agalma, is the object A in the real. Now, the concept of the real took two forms in Lacan. The early Lacan talked about the real as the same as reality, and he didn't capitalize it, and it wasn't a register. And it was also disruptive of the symbolic, right? It's like the horror, the crime, the ori, that was the real. That's the way Zizek, as a materialist philosopher, interpreted the real. But I interpret the real, the later real, in the form of Zen. What it means is the ultimate reality. And it means emptiness, meaning that all the words depend on emptiness, because each one doesn't have its meaning other than in relationship to everything else. But their own meaning is empty. And that's the same for us. So you can say, well, I have the image of my body. I am my body. I am my thoughts. I am my values. And then I am what I am, or I am this I am. And this, what I am, or this that I am, is the real. And the real is a form of jouissance, meaning is a form of bliss. Now, I developed different forms of jouissance because Lacan spoke of 6, but he used them as words, but not as concept. So I developed a concept of 3 types of jouissance and 3 types of the third jouissance. Jouissance is not a feeling, because jouissance is both pleasant and unpleasant at the same time, right? Joy is pleasant, sadness is unpleasant, anger is usually unpleasant, love is usually pleasant. But then there are feelings that are mixed, pleasant and unpleasant. So Lacan called that jouissance, and we don't translate it into English, because in English it would be the word joy, and it would be a form of joy and pain, together, maybe plain, but so it was kept in French as jouissance. So the first jouissance is a fusion with the mother that needs to happen. But then the father needs to intervene and separate the fusion of the mother and child. And then the child, the father, tells the child, you're a girl or you're a boy. So biology or anatomy doesn't dictate sexual difference. The father does, as the big other, right, representing the big other in society. And that's why there's so much trouble in politics now about gender, because it all has to do with the power of the mother and the power of the father, and then becomes the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But the father has to separate the child from the mother. And then the girl becomes a girl, and she doesn't have a penis. She's a female. So if she accepts that, then she becomes the apple of the eye of the father, beautiful girl. And then she identifies with the mother as a woman, and identifies with the gender role of the mother, and then also competes with the mother. So that is called phallic jouissance. The father established phallic jouissance because he has a phallus. And then when they grow up, it's what's necessary for marriage and for procreation is to have phallic jouissance. But eventually, marriage and sex and phallus and company is not enough to make a person happy. So because of those dissatisfaction, then they look for spiritual practice like meditation. And that becomes the third jouissance, the other jouissance. And it has 3 forms. One is feminine jouissance, which, contrary to Freud, Lacan said that women experience something else other than phallic jouissance or penis envy, which is when they have sex and orgasm. It's like the receptive position is like a feeling of emptiness or wonder or being a rainbow, something like that. Then the second form of the third jouissance is the jouissance of the mystic, which is the jouissance of meditation. Lacan calls it mysticism. We don't call it mysticism and Zen. I mean, Dogen was a kind of mystical realist, he's been called, right? So maybe you can say mystical realism. But it would be incorporate, meditation, but also, the mystics of Christianity and Hinduism and so on. And finally, the third jouissance of the third jouissance is jouissance of meaning. And by meaning there, Lacan means enigmatic meaning. It's like, Lacan wrote enigmatic texts. Freud wrote more of scientific texts. Lacan wrote more enigmatic philosophical texts for psychoanalysis. And of course, the reading of the sutras and the Bible is reading an enigmatic text that enters us in a different jouissance by reading the text. It's like a meditative state through the text.
So maybe just a couple of questions. I'm really curious about your interpretation of the real with a capital R. The way that you spelled out these various forms of jouissance seems to put a great importance on the kinds of social determinations that are familiar to our society. And correct my understanding if it's not correct here, that in a sense, it delimits the possibility or obscures to some extent the nature of the real. So, I mean, one of my understandings of the real in Lacan's terms is that I think maybe, as you mentioned, it could represent a kind of horror or a sort of primordial trauma or the very limit of our understanding.
Right. It breaks the bonds. But then the later Lacan gets into topology. And he says the first knot of three, RSI, is always under threat by the real, because the real is always attempting to produce a horrible image or break the bonds of language or of understanding. So he says what's necessary is to introduce a fourth ring to create a topological knot of four. And this fourth ring, the real, functions as a creator of unions, a creator of harmony. So it's totally different. A lot of people reject it because they like the Lacan that's more linked to Freud and the divided subject, right? It's always divided. But here he creates a holism with the real, which comes closer to holistic thought,
So in this later Lacan, and I'm wondering if this is the criticism of the Lacanians who err on the side of Freudianism, and really my understanding of this is quite limited, but is there criticism that perhaps this later Lacan forecloses upon the sort of vagueness or the perforated aspect of the imaginary and the symbolic in some sense? And is it the case that the real and the later Lacan somehow circumscribes all other aspects of, for example, our social reality, the original circles of the Borromean knot, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real with a small r? Like what is actually the difference that's happening there? Does it somehow then validate all of the other structures, like the father, the mother, and the process of the mirror stage?
Yeah, because ultimately the mirror is empty. Right? In Zen, there's a teaching of the mirror. And so you become like a mirror, empty mirror in meditation. And then anybody who steps in front of you, you simply reflect them without adding any subjective distortion of your own. Your mind has been cleared. That's different than psychoanalysis. Because psychoanalysis, you have to get into the fantasy and explore the fantasies and interpret the symbolic meanings and so on, right? But the use of the mirror is the same.
One of the things that I see in Lacanian psychoanalysis that seems to rhyme with my understanding of Zen Buddhism, for example, that we might not see, for example, in a sort of orthodox Freudian approach to psychoanalysis or even Jung's psychoanalysis, is that, well, in the case of Jung and Freud, there's almost a very processual way that, well, in Jung's case, individuation is understood, or in Freud, the sort of unbinding from, or at least realizing one's connection to Oedipus, for example. But it seems in Lacan, and here I'm just thinking about the notion of scansions, right? These highly truncated psychoanalytic sessions where a kind of, well, we don't have individuation per se, but we have a kind of realization or enlightenment, or at least a break with those structures that seem to bind us and keep us from the real in some ways. How does Lacan's psychoanalysis differ in that aspect? And perhaps is it drawing on, some of the ideas that we see in Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, of a kind of instant enlightenment of sorts? That was the one thing I didn't read that in the chapters that I picked out for myself, but it was something that I seemed to infer based on the connections that you were making in the book.
Well, that's what he does in Seminar 1, the way he introduces, these radical koan teachings or expressions, which are brief and is simultaneous rather than accumulated knowledge. But, he did very radical, he didn't give appointments anymore. And the waiting room was full of people that had time to wait for him, time and money to wait for him. And then he would go out and just choose somebody to come in. And then the sessions were like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But they were all like that, For example, one woman was talking about being a victim of the Holocaust and the Gestapo. And he rhymed the word, I think, caress with, in French, caress of the face. And he got up from his chair, went over and caressed her face. And then the session was over.
And a lot of that seems to rhyme with things that we see in Zen koans, for example. I mean, you talked about the finger pointing away to the moon. I know that there's one koan, and I can't remember who the Zen teacher was, but there was a particular student who, whenever they did something that affected the teacher in a certain way, the teacher would stick his finger up. And then this happened multiple times until the point the student himself stuck his finger up, whereupon they cut the finger off, right? And then the teacher stuck the finger up once again, and it was in that moment a kind of enlightenment occurred. So I do see a parallel there. What is happening in Zen Buddhism when we read one of these stories? What is meant to happen to the practitioner? What is meant to happen to Lacan's analysans with the caress of the face?
Well, first of all, it's supposed to have a healing effect. In the koan with the finger, that one's not the finger pointing at the moon. But that one with the pointing of the finger is that, the student cannot imitate the teacher. If the student tries to imitate the teacher, then he gets hit or killed or something. So he tried to imitate the teacher, and the teacher cut his finger. So to teach him that the symbolic castration, that one comes from zero. And you have to be zero first in order to be able to have one.
So this raises a question for me about, I'm thinking about Lacan, the name of the Father, the whole concept of authority and transgression. What is Lacan's view on the nature of the law and our confrontation with it and our desire to transgress it? And how is it, for example, that something like, just to bring the Buddhist piece in here, how does this image of the law, or this attempt to either emulate the law, and then the teacher commits this horrible and heinous act upon the student, and then in that moment a kind of enlightenment occurs? Where does that leave the law within Lacan's view after this kind of healing or enlightenment happens?
Well, it's like the other koan, the monk was asked, if they're enlightened, they're still subject to karma. And he said, no, I'm not subject to karma anymore. I can do whatever I want after enlightenment. And he was reborn as a fox for 500 years until he went back and said, no, once enlightened, you're still you have to be careful because you're still subject to karma. So that's being subject to the law. So there's the law of karma in Buddhism, and in monotheism is the law of the Lord, right? And so the Lord says, creates first with Noah the first courts and judges to resolve problems in the community. And then with the Torah, he gives the law, the commandment by which people have to live in order to live a holy life and redeem the world.
I want to talk about Lacan's concept, or at least the way in which the concept of wu in Chinese, or in Japanese, it's called mu, nothingness, connects to, and maybe to sort of build this up just a little bit. One of the things that I've been focusing on the podcast is a discussion of Carl Jung's concept of individuation, which is very monotheistic in the sort of way that there's a capital S self waiting for us at the end of the individuation process. But what we see in Buddhism, and what seems to resonate with Lacanian psychoanalysis, is this concept of something like a no self with a lowercase s, but maybe it's not even just that. The phrase in the particular chapter in the book that I'm thinking of is this concept of a big mind. So where does Lacan's psychoanalysis sit within the tradition of psychoanalysis amongst Freud and Jung with respect to the notion of a self with a capital S? And how does this concept of a big mind or no self play a role in helping us understand Lacan's view?
Well, I wrote another book called The Concept of the Individual in Psychoanalysis. So that would be a reference to discuss what the different people mean by the self. Freud didn't talk about the self. Freud talked about the ego. Then the object relations talked about the true self. And then Kohut in Chicago talked about the true and the false self. In Lacan, there's the imaginary ego. Then the subject is symbolic because the subject is the same as the signifier, right? So your name is your signifier. The name of the father is your signifier. And then in Jung, the big self is the big self of Hinduism. So there he takes a Hindu position without knowing it or without saying it, that Hindus believe in reincarnation and that you develop yourself from lifetime to lifetime until you achieve this big self, big soul realization. In Buddhism, you also transmigrate or are reborn rather than reincarnated, because when we die, our body dies, our senses die, our sense consciousness dies, our rationality dies, a sense of ego and personality dies. But when in Buddhism we call it the eighth consciousness, which is the memory, doesn't die. And the ninth consciousness, which is Buddha consciousness, doesn't die either. So it goes on to make up your next lifetime. And in Jung, Jung, his genius for me was his memory. I read the Dreams and Reflections, autobiography, or the Red Book. But he has detailed memories, from 2 years old. And he describes his study was his own personality rather than the study of the personality of patients like in Freud. Anyway, his father was a priest, reformed priest. He was not religious. Even people think he's religious. He was not really religious. He felt that religion was forced on him like the unconscious. So you have to individuate the different aspects of the psyche. And in Lacan, there's no individuation, but he says there's two kinds of identity. One is collective, given by the signifier and by society, and the other one is individual, given by the individual relationship to their nature. So, of course, capitalism is based on individualism, socialism is based on collectivism, but they're both necessary. We have to fit with the group, and on the other hand, we have to develop new thinking and new ideas and new forms of life. So those are two forms of the individual. And, ideology is the individual. In politics, it's all imaginary. It's like watching the news about Trump. You get sick of it eventually. It's all in the imaginary. So in Buddhism, there's no self, meaning there's no self, because all we are is an aggregate of perceptions, sensations, feelings, and impulses or drives or instincts, and consciousness, which is mind. But mind also includes the unconscious. So in Buddhism, you individuate different parts of the psyche, the anima and animus, to the collective and personal unconscious. And in psychoanalysis, you adapt to society on the one hand. On the other hand, you become a rebel, with your own desire. So that rebellious aspect is not there so much in Zen, although Zen also has a rebellious aspect, right? Like Rinzai said, if you meet the Buddha down the road, kill him. So that's kind of rebellious or iconoclastic.
Let me ask you this. I want you to imagine for a moment that I came to you and said, look, I've been reading about Lacan a little bit, and I've come across this concept of jouissance, and I've recognized in myself that I have this utter addiction to social media. And as much as I hate it, and I hate myself for using it, I keep coming back to it, and it's utterly controlling my life. And I mean, first of all, would this be an adequate reading of jouissance, where there's this kind of confusion of pleasure and pain in some way that's created this feedback loop that I cannot get out of? And if this is a true symptom of our time, how would the convergence of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Buddhism, like what is the approach that you would encourage for a potential practitioner of Buddhism? I mean, clearly it would be sitting, but maybe from a Lacanian perspective, what are the kinds of interventions? What are the sorts of words that you would give to a potential practitioner who's coming in with something like an addiction, for example?
I mean, we all use the media, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're using the media now.
Sure.
I use the computer to write emails and to watch movies. I don't have a TV anymore. So I think that's inevitable.
Mm.
It depends how much time you spend on it. And also, if you're addicted to video games or to pornography. So the media has to be kept at a distance,
Mm.
Like I said, I feel much better now not watching news. I used to watch every day the PBS NewsHour. And even it's pretty kind of left wing. I can't watch it.
Does that not run the risk in some way? I mean, how do we navigate the risk of, staying uninformed with just the sort of absolute incessant flow of media stimulation? Certainly Lacan, nor would the Buddhists of old, want us to experience this kind of ignorance. Maybe that's a way for us to sort of mediate the flow in some ways. But if some of our challenges to finding a kind of harmony in our society involve stemming these flows, what does Lacan or a Lacanian inflected Buddhism have to say about changing our society? And it just makes me think, just reflecting on Freud and Jung, for example. Part of Freud's purpose was to get analysants to recognize Oedipal attachments so that they could be renormalized in some way, to go live productive lives, maybe even get married, have families of their own. For Jung, he believed that there's an impulse within all of us to transform, to individuate. And if we would heed that call in some way, our society would be transformed at large. How does it work for Lacan? How does it work for a Lacanian inflected Buddha?
He didn't believe in ideal societies, He thought society was a piece of shit, and it's always been a piece of shit, and it will always be a piece of shit. And there's no use trying to repair, because when you try to repair, you make it worse. So you're not going to find any teaching about society there. And in Buddhism, the Buddha never joined wars. He looked at the fighting at a distance and felt sorry for them, and felt that they were delusion, that's the life of samsara, and he wasn't living in that world anymore. He lived in the world of nirvana. So if you stay in retreat, in a monastery, then you stay calm and cool and don't have to get involved in all the problems of the world. But then we have the Mahayana ideal of the bodhisattva. And the bodhisattva goes out there and gets killed trying to help people. But the bodhisattva itself is not angry. He's not a right-wing or political or left-wing political nuts that is angry and complaining. No, he does things, or she does things, to help people, but without agitating or fighting, because politics is all about fighting. We're going to go there and fight for you, and we're going to fight for this, and we're going to fight for that. And there's no fighting in Buddhism. It's just doing things effectively to help others.
Could we talk a little bit about Nirvana and enlightenment? One of the interesting things in the book, I thought, was the connection between Nirvana and the death drive. And perhaps you could just say a few things about that.
Yeah, because, Schopenhauer and Freud took this idea that Nirvana was a reduction of all tensions to level 0. And part of it's an aspect of Nirvana, but that creates a duality between tension and peace, samsara and nirvana. Whereas Nagarjuna, who was the second Buddha at the same time of Jesus, he said that nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana. That you get attached to nirvana, when you want to reduce all tension, and you end up dead. And you get attached to the pleasures of samsara, which also kill you. So the death drive has two sides, one that is constructive and one that is destructive. The constructive side is like, what Heidegger said, we're being towards death, meaning that we're all going to die and we're developing our being or our individuation in relationship to death. But death is not the same as the death drive, because the death drive is, like what drives people to reproduce. Because reproduction, biological reproduction, is the life drive. It creates larger unities. But sex is more based on passion and destructiveness and jealousy and envy and all of that. So what people thought it was the life drive is the death drive, and what people thought was the death drive is the life drive. So that's how I reconcile these terms.
Maybe the last big conceptual question that I have for you, and I'm coming back to the concept of jouissance, which I think is, for me, like one of the most interesting and profound concepts in Lacan's corpus. There is a story. It's about the Buddhist monk Dongshan, if I'm not mistaken. And it's the teaching of just this, right? I think even Alan Watts had, something similar where he says, this is it. And part of this teaching was, and correct me if I'm wrong here, it's Dongshan to one of his students, where he encouraged that student to meditate on a mountain, which we ordinarily think as a kind of still or, non-moving object or obstacle, and with a river flowing down it. But part of this meditation had to do with illuminating the non-duality of nature, in which it is the mountain that's moving, but at a very sort of slow pace or intensity. And the river is still somehow. How does that connect to jouissance? I've read it in the book, but I'd like to hear it in your own words, how we can use that particular image to understand Lacan's jouissance.
Well, just this, Dongshan was the founder of the Chaodong school, or Sotosen as it's called in Japan. And that's a school I'm in too. And when there was a student, I remember he said that to his teacher, or whether the student said that to him as his teacher. What if people ask me, can you tell me something about how my teacher was? And the dual conventional side would be to say, oh, he was nice, he was good looking, he had a strong voice, well, he meditated like a mountain, yet he was funny, all of which may be true. But all those are dual and relative. So instead, he said, just say, just this. What was my teacher like? Just this. And then when you're in that state of bliss of just this, you're the same as all the ancestors.
Could we say then that, let's rework that image a little bit. Oh, I have this teacher, such a wonderful guy, a great communicator of his ideas, good-looking guy. And part of that duality obscures the fact that, behind the scenes, he's a monster. Is that part of, sort of unpacking this non-duality, is that often in our description or our perceptions of people, we elide this other kind of shadow aspect of them, to the extent that by moving to either pole, we do lose that kind of immediacy of just this. Is that an adequate interpretation of what we're talking about here?
Well, just this means to be in samadhi, to be in a state of bliss. And that makes it sound, because you've gone through all the pain. You sat through all the pain. You accepted all the pain in the knees and the body. And once you accept that, then it becomes bliss. And that is what is just this. Now, in psychoanalysis, Freud said that psychoanalysis invented a new mental state, or a new subjective state. So the analyst is in passive, like a Zen teacher, doesn't say much, and offer answers in short, enigmatic sayings, like a Zen teacher. And they have to be in self-control. And you have to go through your own analysis to be a good analyst, and you have to go through a lot of meditation to be a meditation teacher. So in the end, you become inanimate. You don't feel anything. So when people hate you in the transference, and say you're this or you're that, okay, say more. I understand. And then you're going to work in the position of the analyst. But if you haven't done that personal transformation, you can't. And eventually you get rid of the greed, hate, and delusion. You don't have any greed. Although in psychoanalysis, you ask to be paid.
Right.
The Zen teacher just asks for donations, and but the analyst at the end of each session, the Lacanian analyst asks to be paid. That's the only human desire they are allowed to have. Otherwise, they have to have this desire of the analyst, which is a desire not to be idealized. Not for people. Most people, we want to be the followers to praise our ego. And the analyst doesn't want to be idealized or praised. That's the desire of the analyst, not to be idealized. And therefore, they're not worried about it. They stay calm.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I've always thought about psychoanalysis, especially after studying Buddhism, is that in some sense it recapitulates that transference relationship that you have between student and Roshi, analyst and an analyst. And it seems quite valuable from the perspective of interrogating those attachments that we have. I would want to ask you, as we head towards wrapping up here, after having done Buddhism now for, as you said, over 40 years, right? What do you think your biggest challenge, or what do you think a sort of recurrent obstacle on your own path or your own dharma has been that you reflect on?
Well, I think it's the difficulty of transmission, finding people who have the capacity and the motivation to do the practice, to study the difficult texts. So, I have a small number of students who I'm transmitting psychoanalysis to, and they're becoming analysts. And I have a few Zen students who I ordained, and will give Dharma transmission, but they're very few. So I'm a little worried that there's not enough people, because most people are interested in other things.
Well, as we head towards wrapping up, if people want to reach out to the kinds of resources that you offer, whether it's, becoming an ordained Buddhist priest or to study psychoanalysis yourself, where are these institutions, and how can they get in touch with you and your organizations?
Okay. Well, I have a private practice website with all my information, phone number, address, everything, and the titles of my books. And so people can contact me there. My address is in El Cerrito. I live on the top of a mountain overlooking the bay, and it's 1020 King Drive in El Cerrito. And I have a website for Blue Mountain, for the Zen Center, with the address and the email. And I usually get emails from people, and then I invite them to come and give them instruction or help them set up a schedule for themselves, constant practice, once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever. And then I have the website of the Chinese American Center for Freudian and Lacanian Studies. And I also have a website there. And if people are interested in that, because in a way, teaching in China has helped me understand, what's happening now beyond socialism and capitalism. But also, all the Chinese are very Buddhist, and Chinese language is very Buddhist language already. And they're very receptive to receive psychoanalysis with Chan characteristics, instead of a capitalism with socialist characteristics,
Right.
characteristics, it's psychoanalysis with Chan characteristics.
Great. Well, Raul, it was wonderful speaking with you. I will grab all those links from you in a subsequent email. And when I put this episode out, I will put everything on there. And maybe one last thing. Are you working on any books or any other writings right at the moment?
Let me see. Well, I wrote an autobiography, but my publisher doesn't publish autobiographies. So I probably have to wait until I'm dead to publish it. And I wrote a new book on a new methodology to how to evaluate the effectiveness of psychoanalysis, whether, because it costs a lot of money, a long time, you might as well make sure you're paying for something that's going to help you eventually. How do you measure that? And you can measure it in the ordinary scientific way, like psychology does with the Cartesian, how do you call it? The XY axis, the Cartesian plane. Psychoanalysis, the effectiveness of psychoanalysis had to measure in the quantum plane, which is with imaginary numbers instead of real numbers. And that's how you measure the effectiveness, because if you just measure with real numbers, it's not going to look effective. But if you measure it with imaginary numbers, then you can show the effectiveness of analysis. So that's my last book.
Well, I have to say, I'm very curious about that. Okay, well, once again, thank you. And it was great having you on the show.